Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Well, today I have a brief update for you because overnight a statement was issued by the European Council's Sub-Council of Environment Ministers, which is actually very important and picks up on some of the points that were shared by engineer Giuseppe Montesano on this channel last week during the interview, of which many of you were aware, having watched that video. So I wanted to share this update with everybody and talk about some of the implications. So on that note, what we'll do is actually go straight to the statement itself, because it is available now online. And what we have here is basically that the 2040 climate target is actually the subject of the communication, and the sub-council has agreed its position on a 90% emission reduction. So that's quite a significant step, because the council, or as a sub-council to the overall European Council, is very influential and important in terms of being able to persuade all member states to adopt certain policy positions. So it's a really critical part of the lawmaking process in the European Union. Now here, the headline is really that the 90% emission reduction target by 2040 is now more or less supported by the committee. But the key thing here is that the basis for the 90% reduction includes flexibility and other key elements for the post-2030 climate framework in Europe. So that's really important to note as well. So yes, the European Environment Council has agreed that 90% by 2040 is a reasonable emission reduction goal. However, because of the competitiveness concerns and other concerns of member states, which Giuseppe shared with us on the channel last week, we have now introduced, or at least the Council has adopted, support for various flexibility provisions. And so if we have a look now at what those specific provisions are, that essentially the first one, and this is really important because previously we have talked about the possible entry into Europe again of international carbon credits. And that would follow what was effectively a ban on the import of international carbon credits, which began at the end of 2020. And these credits, or the credits that were imported prior to 2020, which were several billion tons over the period from about 2006 or 2005 all the way through to 2020, the European Union, both through the EU emissions trading system and also through member states purchasing activities alone, probably imported around 2.5 billion tons of credits from mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. But for various reasons regarding the system itself and concerns about environmental integrity, concerns about an oversupply of carbon credits and the like, the European Union decided to scale back those imports and eventually phase them out by 2020. However, with the new Article 6 rules agreed as of last year's Conference of the Parties in Azerbaijan, there is now an agreement among the European Union member states that these Article 6 rules now represent something that's more tangible and usable for the Union. And so what's happened here, though, is the European Environment Council has actually increased the quota potentially from 3% to now 5%, which would begin from 2036. But there's now also discussion of a pilot period. So that's quite important. So prior to this communication, the understanding was that any imports of international carbon credits would be able to accrue from 2036 onwards, which is still the case. But there's now also discussion of a pilot period in which this measure can be trialled. And we don't know much more detail other than what is in this communication, but that provides a really interesting platform from which European entities can now start to explore the market and prepare for the possible entry of a larger quota of imported international credits. That may be at the moment exclusively for member states, but it's quite possible because companies are very much a part of this competitiveness concerns as well, that there may be some degree of flexibility provided also for installations in the European emissions trading system. So that's really a very important thing to come out of this declaration or statement from yesterday. We also have an acknowledged role for domestic permanent carbon removal. So this is essentially technologies which are able to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then store the carbon dioxide on a permanent basis, so without any potential for leakage. Now, that is very important because that would give rise to a potential market for removals, whether it be forestry-based projects or other engineered removals like carbon capture and storage and so forth, could actually then benefit from the carbon price signal that's afforded in Europe through the European emissions trading system. And that would be very significant. So another key element here is an acknowledged role for domestic carbon removals. Moving on, the elements for the post-2030 framework include various initiatives to try and improve the competitiveness of industry through simplification of different rules and regulations, which is very important. I think Giuseppe mentioned that in some detail. We also have some discussion about what's called a just transition, which essentially takes account of the fact that there are some countries in the European Union, perhaps more wealthy than others, who've got a greater capacity to meet these targets. And there also is an acknowledgement that there will be certain groups, lower income groups and so forth, that need some support along the way to the extent that this imposes cost. There's also continued focus on things like energy efficiency and renewables, which is absolutely clear because the European Union is very dependent on imports of energy, as we've discussed before on the channel, and both renewables and energy efficiency go a long way to reducing those fuel dependencies and energy dependencies. Interestingly, renewables themselves do represent a slight risk for Europe in that they don't actually produce all the technology and the materials for renewable energy installations domestically, and that creates some dependencies on other countries as well. But this is really important to see this acknowledged in the statement coming out of the Council. And moving on, there's going to be reviews done of the target. But another really important one, and I think this is probably the final point to note from the substantive elements of the communication, is that there's been a decision to postpone the entry into force of the ETS2, the second emissions trading system, from 2027 now back to 2028. So that and the ETS2 basically is an emissions trading system that's being designed to be able to include buildings and also road transport in the overall emissions trading framework, albeit in a separate unlinked program for the time being, and giving entities one more year to deal with the complexities associated with this system and the reporting that's going to be needed, the development of compliance strategies. But this is also very important because it represents a more feasible timeframe over which to introduce the provisions for ETS2. So this is extremely interesting and important in terms of the markets, because all of these things, if they're eventually approved by both the European Commission and also the broader European Council, they'll need to be considered also by the European Parliament. represents something which is very substantial and important for the development of markets. Just a word on this. It's not the final word, of course. It does need further debate and discussion, but the position of the European Environment Council is very important. So from a market perspective, the 5% level is going to increase the amount of demand that will be possible in the European Union. There isn't really any clarity at this point in time whether 5% is going to be applied to the baseline level emissions annually or just as a one-off for the whole period from 2036 to 2040. But what we can see is that there's continually more flexibility being added in here. So the direction of travel, if we remember earlier in the European summer, so around June or July, the proposal was for a 3% allowance. Well, that's now moved up to 5%. There's now also a pilot period from 2031 to 2035. So we can sort of now begin to see a pattern emerging, is that the member states who've been concerned about competitiveness and costs are now beginning, or there's evidence now that they're beginning to persuade others that there needs to be a little bit more focus on these flexibility provisions. And that's very interesting as these negotiations unfold, to see how that manifests and also to look at what the market implications are of those. Just a word of caution, though, and I'll switch across here now to a recent article which actually was published just yesterday by the WWF environmental NGO. I'll just bring that up now. Just to show, so the WWF is saying that, yes, sure, the 90% reduction is on paper, but in reality, it's much less than or lower than 85%. And the suggestion is that these flexibility provisions are really watering down the climate ambition of the European Union. And so I wanted to show that simply to highlight that yes, it's true that the member states are working with the Commission and negotiating for greater flexibility. However, there are still concerns coming out of influential non-governmental organisations, particularly WWF and others. So there will be critics of the work that's being done to introduce flexibility. Frankly and personally, I think that there's far too much at stake economically for European Union member states, especially when we consider some of the geopolitical movements going on, the decisions that have been made to restrict energy supplies from lower cost jurisdictions such as Russia and so forth, really does create an imperative, if the European Union wants to continue to pursue those, to do something to compensate. So yes, there may be some criticisms coming through from influential environmental NGOs, but in principle, I'm not really convinced that those arguments are strong enough just at the moment, because yes, it's very important to deal with climate change and have a sustainable environment, but not at the expense of overall economic prosperity, which underpins a lot of the European Union's capacity to do important work in the area of the environment. So I thought it was important to illustrate that those alternative voices are out there for the purposes of the channel, so people can, so you can, as viewers, you can keep an eye on that as well. But in principle, I think the direction of travel here from the member states and the European Union as a whole, or the Commission, is a very interesting and positive one. So on that note, what do you think? Please let me know what you think of these proposals in the comments section below. And if you've reached this far, please click like on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, remembering we've got a target to achieve 500 subscriptions to the channel by Christmas, the 25th of December 2025. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon on the next episode of Climate Mondial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.